The little black girl ran to the biker beneath the overpass as a silent figure followed her through the neon streets. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The night air was thick with the hum of neon lights that lit up the quiet streets of the city. The sound of distant car engines, the echo of hurried footsteps, and the occasional honk of a horn were the only things breaking the silence. Beneath the overpass, where the shadows grew long and the air smelled of damp concrete, a small figure appeared, running faster with each step. A little black girl, no more than 10 years old, her tear-streaked face hidden behind the tangled mess of her hair, ran with all the speed she could muster. Her small feet hit the pavement hard, barefoot, the cold asphalt biting into her skin. She glanced over her shoulder, her heart racing as if the very ground she ran on was chasing her. She was desperate, terrified of the figure trailing behind her, a silent shadow that seemed to stalk her every move. She had no time to think, no time to wonder who the shadow was. She had only one mission, to find safety. As she ran, she spotted them, bikers. A group of them, parked beneath the bridge, their motorcycles lined up like a barricade of steel and leather. The glow of their bikes' headlights lit up the dark street, casting long shadows on the ground. She sprinted toward them, her breath coming in quick gasps. "Please," she cried, her voice trembling with fear. "Help me." The bikers, who had been talking among themselves, turned in unison as they saw her approach. Their eyes, sharp and steady, took in the sight of the frightened girl, her ragged clothes and the obvious fear etched into her face. It didn't take long for them to understand something was wrong. A few of the bikers, including the leader, a tall man with a deep scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. His name was Jake, and his eyes locked onto the girl. "What's going on, little one?" he asked, his voice low and calm, as though he were talking to a friend. The girl, her hands shaking, pointed down the street, where the shadow had stopped for a moment. "They're coming for me," she whispered. "Please, you have to help me. I'm scared." The bikers exchanged glances, their hands instinctively resting on the leather handles of their bikes. Jake didn't hesitate. "Stay here," he ordered. "We'll take care of this." He turned to his crew, a mix of seasoned bikers with hard eyes and cold hearts. "This little girl needs us. We're not leaving her behind." The group nodded, their faces hardening with resolve. There was no question about it. They had a promise to keep, and they weren't about to break it now. The air was still thick with tension as they prepared for what came next. The girl, her heart still racing, watched as they moved into action. She had no idea who these men were, but something in their eyes told her that she was safe for now. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to breathe a little easier. The bikers, with their dark leather jackets and imposing figures, gathered their things and mounted their bikes. They were ready to ride. The silent figure that had been following her was still out there, but now, it was no longer just the girl running alone in the dark. She had a crew, and they were ready to face whatever came next. The sound of motorcycles revved up, filling the night air with their thunderous roar. The group of bikers, led by Jake, surged forward, their headlights cutting through the darkness as they followed the small girl's trembling steps. She led them down narrow streets and past darkened alleys, every shadow now a threat, every sound amplified in the eerie quiet. Jake kept his eyes on the girl, who was still shaking, her face pale under the streetlights. They needed answers, but for now, the most important thing was to get her somewhere safe. They didn't have time to waste. They had to stay ahead of whatever danger was tailing her. "Stay close," Jake said to the others as they sped down the road. The team followed, their bikes cutting through the streets with precision, forming a wall of steel behind the girl. She kept looking over her shoulder, and Jake could feel her fear rising. He glanced at her, his voice steady as he spoke. "You're safe now. We won't let anyone hurt you." The girl, barely 10 years old, nodded weakly but said nothing. Her eyes darted around, every creak and crack in the night seeming to set her on edge. Jake had seen fear like this before. He had seen it in soldiers who had faced death and in people who had been pushed to their absolute limits. "We're almost there," Jake said. They turned down another street. This one even darker than the last. The neon lights from the bars and clubs barely reached here, and the air felt thick and heavy. Where are we going? One of the bikers asked, glancing at Jake. Just trust me, Jake replied, his voice low and filled with certainty. They weren't far from the place Jake had in mind, a small, forgotten neighborhood on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was quiet, and it would give them a chance to regroup. As they reached the neighborhood, the girl pointed to a house at the end of the street. It looked abandoned, the windows boarded up, and the porch sagging in the middle. The smell of decay lingered in the air. That's it, the girl whispered, her voice trembling. Jake parked his bike and motioned for the others to follow. The girl had stopped walking, staring at the house as if it held the answers they were looking for. You sure? Jake asked. The girl nodded, though she seemed unsure. It's the only place they'll take him. Jake didn't question her any further. He knew better than to ask too many questions in a situation like this. The group dismounted, and Jake motioned for the girl to stay close. They approached the house cautiously, every step measured. The windows were dark, and the front door creaked open as they pushed it. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, and the walls were covered in old, peeling wallpaper. Where is he? Jake asked, his eyes scanning the room. The girl pointed toward the back, where a faint light flickered beneath the door. He's in there, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, signaling for the others too. Stay alert. He stepped forward, the sound of his boots echoing through the silence. The room was small, the light coming from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the corner of the room, a man was sitting, his back to them. He was tall, wearing a long coat, and his face was obscured by shadows. Jake's instincts kicked in. Who are you? He demanded, his voice sharp. The man didn't move. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the bulb. Then, slowly, the man turned around. His face was cold, his eyes dark and filled with malice. I should have known it would be you, the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Jake's heart raced. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was personal. You know me? Jake asked, narrowing his eyes. The man smirked, a dark glint in his eyes. I've been keeping an eye on you for a long time, Jake. You and your little club. Jake's hands tightened on the handlebars of his bike. What do you want? The man leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. What do you think I want? I want her. He nodded toward the girl, who was standing near the door, her face pale with fear. She's not going anywhere with you, Jake said, his voice calm but firm. The man stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. You don't understand. She's the key to something much bigger than you can imagine. Jake took a step forward, blocking the man's path. She's just a kid. You'll leave her alone, or I'll make sure you regret it. The man chuckled darkly. You can't protect her forever, Jake. You've made enemies you can't outrun. Jake's eyes narrowed. I don't need to outrun anyone. I've got family on my side. With that, he signaled to the bikers to surround the man. The tension in the room was thick, each biker watching closely, ready to move. The girl stepped forward, her voice barely audible. Please, don't hurt him. I need to go with him. They'll find me. Jake turned to look at her. You're not going anywhere with him. Not while we're here. The man's smirk faded, and his eyes hardened. You think you've won, Jake? This is just the beginning. Jake didn't respond. He stepped toward the man, his posture strong, his intentions clear. He wasn't going to let this man take the girl. Not now, not ever. I know you think you've got it all figured out, Jake. The man's voice was sharp, his words cold like steel. But you're wrong. This little girl is nothing more than a pawn in a much bigger game. You can't protect her forever. Jake's hand tightened around the leather grip of his jacket, but his eyes never left the man. He had heard threats like this before. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to use intimidation to gain the upper hand. But this time, things were different. This time, they were protecting something that mattered, something real. I don't care about your game, Jake said slowly, his voice steady. But I'll make sure you lose this round. He could feel the tension in the air, like the stillness before a storm. The girl, her face pale and full of fear, stood at the edge of the room, clutching her arms around herself. I don't want to go with him, she whispered, her voice trembling. I just want to go home. Her words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. Home. What did that even mean anymore? The world she had known had been stolen from her, and Jake wasn't sure if she would ever feel safe again. He didn't know if she would ever have the chance to return to anything resembling the life she once had. But he was going to do everything in his power to make sure she never had to face this kind of fear alone again. "You won't have to go anywhere, kid," Jake said softly, turning toward her, his voice reassuring. "We're going to make sure of that." He gave her a small, but genuine smile, trying to calm the storm inside her. She hesitated, then nodded, her trust in him still fragile but growing. The man standing in front of them was no stranger. Jake recognized the sharpness in his eyes, the arrogance that always came with a man who thought he could control everything. His name was Richard, and he was the one who had been lurking in the shadows of this girl's life, using manipulation and fear to keep her in his grasp. "You really think you can stop me?" Richard scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're just a bunch of outlaws with no real power. You can't protect her from what's coming." Jake stepped forward, his expression hardening. "You've got it wrong, Richard. We don't need power. We have something much stronger than that. We have loyalty, we have family, and we'll fight for her, no matter what." Richard sneered, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Jake had always known how to speak the truth with conviction, how to make people believe that what they were doing was right. He glanced back at the bikers behind him. Each one of them had been through hell and back, but now, they were united for something bigger than themselves. They were here for this girl. "You think you can intimidate us? You don't scare us," Jake said firmly. "You've underestimated the wrong people. This is where it ends." For a moment, the air was thick with silence. The bikers were on high alert, each one preparing for whatever came next. Richard's confidence wavered, but he didn't back down. He glanced at the door, as if considering running, but he knew he was cornered. He had no way out. "You're making a mistake," Richard said through gritted teeth. "You think you've won? There's always another way. You're playing right into my hands. The only thing you've got is a one-way ticket out of here," Jake said, moving closer. His boots echoed on the worn floorboards as he took a step toward Richard, the sound amplified by the silence. "You don't get to threaten her anymore. You're done." Jake's words hit Richard like a slap to the face. Richard stepped back, his eyes flashing with rage, but there was nowhere left to go. The bikers, one by one, closed in around him, a wall of determination and loyalty. "Get out of here, Richard," Jake said one last time, his voice calm but unyielding. "You're not welcome here." For a long moment, Richard said nothing. The fight had gone out of him, and he knew there was no use in pressing further. With a final, venomous glare, he turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps slow and heavy. The bikers didn't move, their eyes locked on him, ensuring he didn't try anything foolish. As soon as Richard was gone, Jake turned to the girl, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but there was a glimmer of hope there too. "I think so," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake nodded. "We're going to take care of you. You're safe now." The bikers, who had been standing quietly in the background, began to move, their energy shifting from tension to relief. The girl's nightmare had come to an end, but Jake knew this was only the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead. But for now, they had won. For now, they had protected her, and that was all that mattered. The tension in the room was thick, but it wasn't the same kind of tension Jake had faced on the road or in the heat of battle. This felt different. It felt personal. The girl, Aisha, stood a few feet away, her face still pale, but there was a spark of something in her eyes now. Something that hadn't been there when she first ran to them under the overpass. Jake could feel the weight of the promise he'd made to her father years ago, a promise that had been tested time and time again, but never more than it was now. He'd said he would protect her, and he intended to keep that word, no matter the cost. "What now?" one of the bikers asked, his voice low. His name was Vince, a trusted member of the crew, a man who had seen enough of the world's darkness to know when it was time to fight and when it was time to stay silent. Jake didn't have an immediate answer. He turned to look at Aisha. Her fingers were still clenched tightly together, but her eyes, those eyes that had once been filled with so much fear, now held something else. A hint of trust. "We keep her safe," Jake said finally, his voice firm. "That's all we do. We keep her safe, and we make sure nothing happens to her." Aisha swallowed, her eyes darting toward the door, as though she were expecting someone to come bursting through. "Will they come for me again?" she whispered. "Will they hurt me?" Jake stepped forward, his large frame blocking her view of the door. "No one's coming for you. Not anymore," he said. His voice was soft, but filled with a quiet strength. "You're with us now." The other bikers exchanged glances, their expressions hardening. This was more than just another job. This was personal. They had all seen their fair share of trouble, but they had never backed down. Not once. Jake motioned for the crew to get ready. "We need to move out," he said. "We'll take Aisha to a place where she can stay safe, and then we'll figure out what's next. But we do this the right way. No more threats, no more games." As the bikers mounted their motorcycles, Jake glanced at Aisha once more. She was looking at him now with something resembling hope, but it was fragile. A part of him couldn't blame her for feeling that way. She had been through more than any kid should have to go through. "Come on, kid," Jake said, offering his hand. "Let's get you out of here." Aisha hesitated for a moment, then slowly took his hand, the warmth of his grip offering some comfort. The bikers revved their engines, the sound roaring to life as they pulled out of the rundown house. Jake led the way, his eyes scanning the road ahead. They weren't out of danger yet. Not by a long shot. They had made a powerful enemy, and enemies like Richard didn't let things go easily. The wind whipped through Jake's hair as he hit the gas, the open road in front of him stretching out like a challenge. He couldn't afford to think about what might come next. He had to focus on getting them to safety, and that meant moving fast. They rode for hours, the bikes cutting through the night, their headlights illuminating the road as they crossed county lines and headed further into the mountains. Jake had a cabin tucked away up in the hills, a place that wasn't on any map, a place that had seen its share of secrecy. It was as close to safety as they were going to get. As they reached the cabin, Jake pulled his bike to a stop and turned to look at the others. "Stay here," he told the group. "I'll take Aisha inside." Aisha was already dismounting from her bike, and Jake helped her off, guiding her up to the porch. She seemed smaller now, more fragile in the dim light. The fear was still there, but it was buried under a layer of exhaustion. He could see it in the way she moved, the way she looked around, as if expecting someone to jump out of the shadows at any moment. He opened the door and led her inside, the warmth from the fireplace greeting them as they entered the small, rustic cabin. Jake closed the door behind them, locking it with a heavy metal bolt. "You're safe here," he said, turning to her. "No one will find you. Not for a while." Aisha nodded, but her eyes were still wide with uncertainty. Quiet after the storm. Inside the cabin, the crackle of the fire was the only sound breaking the silence. Jake stood by the window, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. The moonlight flickered through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. It was the calm before the inevitable storm. He knew Richard wasn't done. It was never just about one thing with people like him. Jake's mind raced, but he kept it steady. The girl, Aisha, was finally asleep in the chair by the fire, her head resting against the backrest, her chest rising and falling gently with each breath. She had been through too much for someone so young. No child should ever have to carry that kind of weight, that kind of fear. But she was strong, and that's what kept her going. Jake ran a hand through his hair and let out a long sigh. He wasn't sure how much longer they could stay hidden. Richard had made it clear. He would come for Aisha, and he would come hard. Jake had made enemies in his time, but nothing like this. Nothing this personal. As the hours passed, Jake continued to pace, lost in thought. It wasn't until he heard the sound of motorcycles approaching that his focus snapped back to the present. He moved quickly to the door and peeked outside. The rumble of engines grew louder, and soon, a convoy of bikes pulled into the cabin's dirt driveway. Jake's heart sank. It wasn't just the usual crew, it was more. He stepped outside just as the bikers dismounted. A familiar face appeared from the shadows. It was Vince. He walked up to Jake, his expression grim. "We've got a problem," Vince said quietly, glancing back at the group. "Richard's not giving up. He's made contact with someone on the inside. He's got resources. People who'll do anything to get to her." Jake nodded. He wasn't surprised. "How many?" "Too many," Vince replied. "And they've got the whole town on edge. The cops are on his side now. He's pulling strings." Jake's fists clenched. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was war. "We're not backing down," he said, his voice steady. "We fight for her. We fight for every kid like her. I don't care who he knows." Vince looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "What's the plan?" Jake paused, his mind working. "Quickly. We make sure she's safe. First priority is getting her out of here before he can make his move. Then we take the fight to him. We end this. He turned back to the cabin, his eyes scanning the dark woods that surrounded them. Get ready. We leave in an hour. No mistakes. Inside, Aisha had woken up, the sound of voices stirring her from sleep. She looked confused at first, then spotted Jake as he entered the room. What's happening? She asked, her voice shaky, but steady. Jake walked over to her and knelt down, making sure she knew she was safe. We're moving you to another place, he said. It's not safe here anymore, but we're going to make sure nothing happens to you. Aisha nodded, but there was still fear in her eyes. She was trying to be brave, trying to be strong, but Jake knew better. She was a child, and this was a nightmare no child should have to face. You're going to be okay, Jake reassured her. We're going to make sure of that. As the bikers prepared to move out, the weight of the situation settled over them. This wasn't just about protecting Aisha anymore. It was about sending a message. They were done running, done hiding. The time had come to fight back. The convoy of bikes revved up, the engines roaring to life as they hit the road, a wall of leather and steel, all united by the promise they had made. The open road stretched out in front of them, and for the first time in a long while, Jake felt a sense of resolve settle into his bones. He wasn't doing this for the glory, for the thrill. He was doing this for Aisha, for the little girl who had been caught in a war she never asked for. He wasn't going to let her down. The ride felt different now. It wasn't just a mission, it was personal. As they sped down the highway, the bikes cutting through the night, Jake's mind raced ahead to what was coming. Richard wasn't going to stop, but neither were they. Jake knew that. They were going to take the fight to him, and they weren't going to stop until it was over. Aisha had a new family now, and this family wasn't going to let her go. Not without a fight. They were getting closer to the heart of it all, the place where the battle would be fought. And when they reached it, they would make sure Richard knew who he was dealing with. The wind howled in their faces as they raced through the night, each biker lost in their thoughts but united in their purpose. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. And they were going to make sure Aisha got the justice she deserved. They were going to make sure that no one, not ever again, would make her feel small, helpless, or afraid. This was far from over. But tonight, they had taken the first step in winning the fight. The bikes roared through the night, their headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. The wind whipped past them, the cold air biting at their faces, but none of the bikers slowed down. They were heading straight for the heart of the danger, and there was no turning back now. Jake, at the front of the pack, kept his eyes focused on the road ahead. His mind raced, but his body was in tune with the rhythm of the ride, as if every mile he covered brought him closer to something bigger than just a fight. The other bikers were with him, their faces set in determination. This was no longer just about protecting Aisha. This was about taking back control. This was about ending the terror that had haunted her life. As the convoy sped down the highway, the distant glow of the city lights slowly faded behind them. They were moving fast, crossing county lines, and leaving behind the shadows of the past. The closer they got to their destination, the more palpable the tension became. The air felt heavy, thick with the anticipation of what was to come. Vince, riding just behind Jake, caught his eye for a moment. "You sure about this?" Vince asked, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. Jake nodded, his jaw clenched. "We do this right. We bring her home." The words hung in the air as they continued to ride, their engines thundering like a storm at their backs. As they approached the outskirts of the town, the first signs of daylight began to creep over the horizon. The night was almost over, but the real fight was just beginning. Jake could feel the weight of the promise he had made to Aisha's father pressing on him. He had sworn to protect her, and now he would face whatever came to keep that promise. He glanced back at Aisha, who was riding in the middle of the group, her eyes wide and full of fear, but also a glimmer of hope. She trusted them now. She trusted him, and Jake would not let her down. They reached the edge of the town, where the streets grew narrower and the buildings began to take on a more sinister appearance. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the streets. "This is it," Jake muttered to himself, looking around. "This is where it ends." The group slowed down, moving cautiously as they neared their destination. They could hear the sound of distant voices and the faint hum of activity in the streets. Jake signaled to the others, his hand held up to stop. The convoy came to a halt, their engines dying down one by one. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their heavy breathing and the distant rustling of leaves. "What now?" one of the bikers asked, his voice low. "We wait for him," Jake said, his voice steady. "And when he shows, we'll make sure he knows what happens when you mess with the wrong people." The bikers dismounted, each of them moving to take their positions. Jake turned to Aisha, who had climbed off her bike and was standing beside him. "Stay close," he said softly. She nodded, her hand trembling as she reached out to grasp his arm. "I'm scared," she whispered. Jake gave her a reassuring smile. "I know, kid. But we're not going to let him get you. Not now. Not ever." They made their way toward the small, run-down building at the end of the street, where they knew Richard would be. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the air heavy with the feeling that something was about to explode. As they approached the door, Jake could hear muffled voices inside. Richard had to be there. The time for talk was over. Jake signaled to the others to get into position. They surrounded the building, each biker taking a place where they could cover all the exits. "We're not here to make a scene," Jake said quietly to his crew. "We're here to take him down. Fast and clean." They moved in. The door creaked open, and they stepped inside, their boots making little noise on the dusty floor. Inside, Richard stood with his back to them, talking to someone in the corner of the room. His voice was low, but Jake could hear the smugness in it. "You think you can just show up here and take what's mine?" Richard said, turning around. "This isn't over, Jake. It's just beginning." Jake took a step forward, his voice cold. "It ends tonight, Richard." Richard's eyes flickered with something that might have been fear, but it was quickly replaced by rage. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat. "I'll make sure you regret this." Jake didn't flinch. "I don't think so." In an instant, the situation escalated. The bikers moved in, but Jake stayed where he was, watching Richard's every move. The fight that followed was swift and brutal, but it wasn't about violence. It was about sending a message. As the dust settled, Jake looked around the room. Richard was on the ground, his face twisted in pain, but Jake didn't feel sorry for him. "You'll leave this town, and you'll stay away from her. Or next time, we won't stop." Richard didn't say anything, his face twisted with rage, but he knew he was beaten. The bikers moved back, allowing Jake to approach Aisha. "It's over," Jake said softly. Aisha looked at him, her eyes wide, but there was a new strength in them now. "It's over," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Jake smiled, feeling a sense of relief settle over him. They had done it. They had kept her safe. But deep down, Jake knew this was only one battle in a much bigger war, and he would be ready for whatever came next. The morning sun was barely rising, casting a golden hue over the distant hills as Jake and the rest of the crew gathered around the cabin. The night's events had left a heavy silence in the air, but the tension wasn't gone. They knew Richard wasn't just going to fade away. Jake stood outside, his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the horizon. He felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. The promise he made to Aisha's father, the responsibility of keeping her safe, and the growing sense that this was far from over. Vince approached, his face grim, his eyes tired from the hours of riding and the aftermath of the confrontation. "You know he won't let this go, right?" Vince said quietly, his voice low, as if not wanting to disturb the quiet that had settled over the cabin. "Yeah," Jake muttered, his gaze unwavering. "But it doesn't matter. We've drawn the line, and we're not stepping back." Vince looked at Jake, his expression hardening. "You think that's enough? Richard's got connections. He's not alone in this. And he's got money, power, things we can't just ride away from." Jake turned to face him, his eyes narrowing. "I know, but we've got something he doesn't have. We've got each other. We've got loyalty." The words rang true, even if Jake wasn't entirely sure what the next move was. It was one thing to take on a man like Richard. It was another to deal with the forces behind him. And right now, Jake didn't know how deep this went. The crew had come together for this mission, but now, as the dust settled, the uncertainty was creeping in. Jake walked back into the cabin, where Aisha was sitting near the fire, her face still looking like she hadn't gotten a full night's sleep. She looked up as he entered, her eyes full of questions, her body language uncertain. "Jake?" she asked quietly. "Are they gone? Is it really over?" Jake walked over to her and knelt down beside her, his voice soft but firm. "It's over for now," he said. "But we have to stay vigilant. Richard might be gone, but his people are still out there. And they're not going to stop until they get what they want. Aisha's face fell, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the situation finally hit her. I don't know what to do anymore, she whispered, her voice breaking. I just want to be normal again. I just want my life back. Jake's heart ached at the sight of her. He had seen too many people go through similar things. People who had their lives turned upside down by forces they couldn't control. But he also knew that he couldn't promise her that things would go back to normal. Not after everything that had happened. Not after what they had just been through. I know, he said gently. But we'll make sure that happens. We'll keep you safe. You don't have to face this alone anymore. Aisha looked at him, her eyes searching his face for reassurance, for something to hold on to. Do you really mean that? She asked. Jake nodded. I swear it. You're with us now. And we won't let anything happen to you. Just then, the sound of a distant engine caught their attention. The deep rumble of a motorcycle broke the silence outside. Jake's eyes immediately flicked toward the window, his instincts kicking in. Get down, he whispered urgently to Aisha. Stay out of sight. The crew quickly sprang into action, moving with the quiet precision of men who had been in countless high-stakes situations before. Jake moved to the door and peered out, his heart rate picking up as he saw the figure in the distance. Another motorcycle, but this one wasn't one of theirs. Jake signaled to Vince, who was already positioned outside. Stay alert, Jake muttered. Let's see what this is about. They waited, watching the lone rider approach, the figure shrouded in the haze of the morning light. As the rider drew closer, Jake's suspicions grew. This wasn't just a random traveler. The rider slowed, coming to a stop just outside the cabin. The engine cut off, and the man removed his helmet. Jake's heart sank as he recognized the face. It was one of Richard's associates. A tall man with dark hair and a scar running down his left cheek. I knew it wasn't over, Jake muttered under his breath. Vince was beside him, his hand resting on his weapon, ready for whatever came next. The man stepped off his bike, his eyes scanning the cabin. I'm not here to fight, the man called out, his voice carrying through the still morning air. I just want to talk. Jake exchanged a look with Vince. Talk? About what? Jake called back, his voice hard. The man raised his hands in mock surrender, his expression calm. I've got information. I know things. Richard, he's not the only one after her. Jake's eyes narrowed, his suspicion growing. Then who else is involved? He demanded. The man glanced over his shoulder, as if making sure he wasn't being watched, then moved closer, lowering his voice. There's a bigger player behind this. Someone who controls everything. Jake stepped forward, his body tense. You're going to have to be more specific than that, he said, his voice low and dangerous. The man nodded. I can tell you everything, he said, his eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and desperation. But we need to move fast. You don't know what's coming. Jake looked back at the cabin, then turned back to the man. Get in. And you better not be wasting our time. The man nodded and followed Jake inside. It wasn't over. And now, Jake had a new problem on his hands. Whoever was behind Richard had just stepped into the picture. And Jake was ready to find out who they were, no matter the cost. The man stepped into the cabin, his eyes darting around nervously as Jake closed the door behind him. Aisha was still sitting near the fire, her expression a mixture of confusion and fear. She looked up at the man, but didn't say anything. Jake could feel the weight of her stare, but he didn't have time to focus on her right now. There was a new threat to deal with, and it was bigger than anything they had faced before. You've got my attention, Jake said, his voice low and measured. Now tell me what you know. Who's pulling Richard's strings? The man hesitated for a moment, looking at Jake as if deciding how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke, his voice trembling slightly. It's not just one person. It's a network. They call themselves the syndicate. They've got eyes everywhere, even in places you wouldn't expect. They control the streets, the businesses, the people. And Richard, he's just a small piece of it. Jake frowned, his mind racing. The syndicate? He'd heard rumors of such an organization before, but it had always seemed like a shadow, a myth. No one had ever confirmed its existence, not until now. What do they want with Aisha? Jake asked, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. The man shifted uncomfortably, clearly not used to being in a position of weakness. She's a liability to them, he explained. They want to silence her. They know she's seen too much, and they can't afford to have her talking. They're trying to cover their tracks, and they'll stop at nothing to do it. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. This wasn't just about protecting Aisha anymore. It was about stopping an entire criminal organization from pulling her deeper into their web. So what's the plan? Vince's voice cut through the tense silence. He had moved closer, his eyes narrowing as he listened. The man looked at him, then back at Jake. I can get you to one of their safe houses, he said, his voice shaking. But you'll need to act fast. They're expecting something from me. I've been feeding them information, but I can't keep it up for long. They'll start looking for me soon. Jake nodded, his expression hardening. We'll do it. But if this is a trap, I swear to God, I'll make sure you regret it. The man nodded quickly, his hands trembling slightly. It's not a trap. I'm trying to help you. Jake wasn't entirely convinced, but he had no choice. Aisha was the priority now. They needed to move. All right, Jake said, turning to his crew. Get the bikes ready. We're moving out. The bikers immediately started gathering their gear, their movements quick and efficient. Jake took one last look at Aisha. She had been quiet, watching the exchange, but now her eyes met his, filled with uncertainty. Jake? She asked, her voice soft. Where are we going? Jake gave her a reassuring smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. We're going to make sure you're safe, Aisha. No one's going to hurt you again. She nodded, though there was still fear in her eyes. She was just a kid, too young to be thrust into this world of danger, too young to know what it was like to live in constant fear. But she had no choice. And now, neither did they. The bikers mounted their bikes, the engines roaring to life one by one as they revved up and prepared to hit the road. Jake looked back at the man. Lead the way, he ordered, his voice cold and steady. The man nodded, his face pale as he moved to his bike. Jake followed closely behind, the rest of the crew right behind him. The convoy rode out, cutting through the empty streets, leaving the cabin behind. As they made their way through the quiet town, Jake's mind was filled with one question. How deep did the syndicate go? He had always known that the world he lived in was dangerous, but this was something else entirely. An underground network, pulling the strings behind the scenes, controlling everything from the shadows. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but one thing was certain. There was no turning back now. As they neared the outskirts of the town, the man led them down a winding road, the trees thickening around them. The sun had fully risen now, casting a soft glow over the landscape, but the calm of the morning only added to the tension. Jake kept his eyes forward, his grip tight on the handlebars of his bike. Every instinct in him told him that something wasn't right, and he wasn't about to let his guard down. The convoy followed the man through the winding roads, the shadows growing longer as the day wore on. The air felt heavier, and Jake's senses were on high alert. They were getting close. Stay sharp, Jake said over the radio, his voice calm but authoritative. We don't know what we're walking into. The man glanced back at them, his face a mask of fear and determination. It's just ahead, he said. The syndicate's safe house is just down this road. Once we're there, you'll have to move fast. They've got eyes everywhere. Jake nodded, his mind already working through the plan. They would get in, get Aisha to safety, and find out everything they could about this syndicate. And when they did, they would bring it all crashing down. As they approached the safe house, the atmosphere grew more tense, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The man led them to a secluded area, a large building hidden away in the trees. It looked abandoned, but Jake knew better. This was it, the beginning of the end. They stopped in front of the building, the bikers dismounting in unison, their eyes scanning the surroundings. The man stepped forward, his movements hurried. We're here, he said, his voice barely a whisper. You'll need to be quick. Jake's team surrounded the building, ready for whatever came next. They had no choice now, they had to see this through. They had to finish what they started, for Aisha and for everyone else who had been trapped in this dangerous game. Jake gave one last glance to his crew before they moved in. It was time to take down the syndicate, and they weren't leaving without Aisha, no matter what it took. The building loomed ahead, a silent and imposing structure hidden deep in the trees. Far from the nearest road, Jake's instincts were screaming at him. Something wasn't right. His grip tightened on the handlebars of his bike as the convoy came to a slow stop. The air was thick with tension. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the kind of unease that comes before a storm. The man who had led them here, his face pale and his movements jittery, was already dismounting his bike. This is it, he said, barely above a whisper. Once you're inside, You need to move fast. They've got eyes everywhere. Jake studied the man for a moment. He wasn't sure he trusted him, but right now, they had no choice but to follow his lead. You stay out here, Jake said, his voice firm. If anything goes wrong, we'll deal with it. You don't step foot inside. The man nodded quickly, his eyes wide with fear. I won't, he said, retreating a few steps. I'll keep an eye on things out here. Jake turned to his crew, his eyes locking onto each of them. We're in this together. No one gets left behind. We get Aisha inside safely, find out what we can, and get the hell out. Fast and clean. The bikers nodded, their faces set with determination. They moved quickly, gathering their gear, ready to move into the building. Aisha stood behind Jake, her small frame dwarfed by the large bikers around her. She looked up at Jake, her expression full of uncertainty. Are we safe here? She asked quietly. Jake smiled at her, though it wasn't the reassuring smile he wanted it to be. You're safe with us, he said softly. I promise. He gave her a quick nod, and the group began to move toward the entrance of the building. As they approached, Jake could see the faint outlines of cameras mounted around the corners, their lenses watching them closely. Stay low, he whispered. Don't let them see you. They reached the door, which was oddly unlocked, as if someone had been expecting them. Jake's heart skipped a beat, but he pushed the feeling aside. They couldn't waste time now. He motioned for Vince to take the lead, and Vince, ever the vigilant one, stepped forward, pushing the door open with the smallest of creaks. The darkness inside was thick, oppressive. The only light came from the flickering bulbs overhead, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. Jake's crew moved in quickly, checking their surroundings. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in months. Keep your eyes open, Jake whispered. This is where it gets tricky. They moved down a long hallway, the sound of their boots muffled against the worn floors. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. Jake could feel the tension rising with every step, the weight of what they were about to uncover pressing down on him. As they rounded a corner, they came to a large room. The door was ajar, and through the small gap, Jake could see figures moving inside. His heart rate quickened. He signaled for the team to stop and crouch low, the crew falling into position without a word. Jake motioned for Vince to approach the door. Vince moved like a shadow, his body blending seamlessly with the darkness. He reached the door and cracked it open just enough to peer inside. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Vince pulled back, his face grim. There's a meeting in there, he whispered, his voice tight. Looks like the whole syndicate is involved. Richard's not the only one pulling strings. Jake's jaw tightened. This was bigger than they had anticipated. The syndicate wasn't just some group of thugs. They were organized, connected, dangerous. He motioned for the crew to stay low and follow his lead. They had to get to the heart of this, find out what was really going on, and get Aisha out before it was too late. We need to move in, find out what we can, Jake said quietly. But remember, we're not here to start a war. We're here for information, and we're getting Aisha out. Vince nodded, his eyes still locked on the room. We'll wait for your signal, he said. Jake took a deep breath and nodded. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. The syndicate had eyes everywhere, and if they were caught, everything would fall apart. He waited for the right moment, the seconds stretching into what felt like hours. When the time was right, Jake gave a quick signal. Vince was the first one in, followed by Jake and the rest of the crew, moving swiftly and quietly. They filed into the room, their presence barely noticeable. The syndicate members were seated at a large table, discussing something in low voices. Jake could hear snippets of their conversation, talk of shipments, territories, and people they controlled. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. They were dealing with a full-scale operation, something far beyond what Jake had imagined. As they continued to listen, Jake's mind raced. He needed to know what was being planned, what the syndicate had in store for Aisha. They couldn't leave until they had that answer. Jake motioned for the crew to move closer. But as they crept forward, one of the syndicate members, sitting at the far end of the table, paused, his eyes scanning the room. Jake's heart skipped a beat. It was too late. They had been spotted. The tension in the room snapped like a taut wire. Jake could feel the shift in the air as the syndicate member at the far end of the table suddenly stopped speaking. His eyes scanned the room, sharp and calculating. It was too late. Jake's crew had been spotted. Shit, Jake muttered under his breath, his hand instinctively going to the weapon at his side. The syndicate member's gaze flickered over the crew, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like time slowed down. Then, the man's lips curled into a knowing smirk. "I knew something was off," he said coolly. "You really thought you could just waltz in here?" Before Jake could react, the room erupted into motion. The other syndicate members jumped to their feet, their hands reaching for weapons hidden beneath the table. Vince was the first to react, pulling his gun and aiming it at the man who had spotted them. "Get down," Vince shouted. The rest of the crew ducked behind the nearest furniture, trying to find cover. Jake's heart raced as the gunfire began. The crack of bullets filled the room, loud and deafening. Jake moved instinctively, his training kicking in as he darted to the side, narrowly avoiding the spray of bullets. The syndicate members were faster than he had expected, their movements sharp and coordinated. They had clearly done this before. Aisha, who had been standing behind Jake, screamed as the chaos unfolded around her. Jake turned quickly, seeing her crouched near the doorway, her hands over her ears, eyes wide with terror. "Aisha, get down," he shouted, rushing toward her. The sound of gunfire was overwhelming, and the air smelled like gunpowder. He grabbed her by the arm and pulled her behind a large, overturned table, shielding her with his body. "Stay here, and don't move," Jake said urgently. Aisha nodded, tears streaming down her face, but her eyes were filled with fear and determination. Jake quickly turned back to the fight. Vince and the other bikers were holding their ground, but it was clear they were outnumbered. The syndicate members were using their surroundings to their advantage, firing from multiple angles and forcing Jake and his crew into cover. "We need to move," Jake shouted, looking around for an escape route. "We can't stay here. We have to get out before they lock us in." Vince nodded, his jaw clenched tight. "Cover me," he yelled as he popped up from behind cover, firing at one of the syndicate members across the room. The exchange of gunfire intensified, but Jake knew they couldn't keep up this fight for long. They had to get Aisha out of here, and they had to do it fast. "Aisha, listen to me," Jake said, turning to face her. "We're leaving now. Stick with me, stay low, and don't look back." "Got it." Aisha nodded, her face pale but resolute. Jake gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder before turning to Vince. "On 3, we move. Stay close and keep firing." Vince gave him a quick nod. "You got it." Jake turned back to Aisha and motioned for her to follow him. "Stay close, Aisha. Don't let go of me." As they crouched low and began to move through the room, gunfire erupted again, forcing them to take cover behind another set of cabinets. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest as he glanced over at the other bikers. They were starting to make their way toward the exit, covering each other as best they could. "We're almost there," Jake muttered to himself, trying to keep his focus. But just as they were about to make it to the door, the sound of footsteps pounding against the floor caught his attention. A syndicate member had flanked them, cutting off their escape route. Without thinking, Jake pushed Aisha behind him and aimed his gun at the man. "Stay back," Jake yelled, his voice filled with authority. The syndicate member hesitated for just a second, his eyes scanning Jake's face, calculating. But before he could react, Vince's voice rang out from the other side of the room. "Jake, move." Jake didn't hesitate. He dove toward the door, grabbing Aisha by the wrist and pulling her with him. They sprinted through the doorway, ducking under another barrage of bullets. The sound of gunfire echoed through the building as they made their way into the hallway. "We're almost there," Jake yelled, his heart racing. The exit was just ahead, but they weren't out of danger yet. Another round of gunfire rang out, missing them by inches as they neared the exit. With one final push, they burst through the door into the open air. Jake didn't stop. He pulled Aisha toward the bikes, where the rest of the crew was already waiting, their bikes revved and ready to go. "Go, go, go," Jake shouted, pushing Aisha toward the nearest bike. He turned to see the rest of the crew quickly following behind them, but they weren't out of the woods yet. The syndicate wasn't far behind. "Get moving," Vince shouted, his voice strained with urgency. The sound of approaching motorcycles echoed through the air, and Jake knew they had no time to waste. They mounted their bikes and sped off, the roar of the engines filling the silence. Jake looked over his shoulder, watching as the syndicate's motorcycles came into view, but they were gaining ground fast. "We need to lose them," Jake said, his voice sharp. He hit the throttle, pushing the bike faster. The wind whipped past them as they sped through the narrow streets, trying to shake the syndicate off their trail. But they weren't going to make it easy. The chase had begun. Aisha clung to Jake, her small arms wrapped around his waist as they sped through the night, the world blurring around them. Jake could feel the tension in her grip, but he couldn't stop now. He couldn't stop until they were safe. The sound of the syndicate's bikes grew louder, their engines roaring in pursuit. Jake's mind raced as he calculated their next move. They needed to lose them, and fast. There was no telling how long they had before the syndicate caught up. But Jake wasn't going to let that happen. Not on his watch. He glanced ahead, spotting a turn just up ahead, a sharp corner that could be their chance to escape. He slammed the throttle, taking the turn at full speed, banking the bike into the curve. The other bikers followed closely behind, but the syndicate was relentless. They were still on their tail. Jake had to think fast. The chase was on, and it was far from over. The engines roared as the convoy of bikes tore through the winding streets, the sound of tires screeching and engines roaring filling the air. Jake's heart raced as he leaned into the curve of the road, the sharp turn coming up fast. Aisha clung tightly to him, her arms wrapped around his waist as the wind whipped past them, threatening to pull them apart. "Hold on tight," Jake shouted over the roar of the engine, his voice barely audible against the wind. Aisha nodded, her face pressed into his back, her grip tightening. Behind them, the sound of the syndicate's motorcycles grew louder, their engines echoing through the night. Jake glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he saw the headlights closing in on them. They were gaining. The syndicate wasn't giving up, and neither was Jake. He slammed the throttle down harder, urging the bike to go faster. "We can't outrun them forever." Vince's voice came through Jake's earpiece. "We need a plan." Jake didn't answer immediately. He was focused on the road, his mind racing as the pavement flew beneath him. He had to lose them. They couldn't keep running like this. "There's a bridge up ahead," Jake said after a beat, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "We'll take it. Cut through the back roads. It's the only way to shake them." Vince responded quickly. "Roger that. We'll follow your lead." Jake didn't wait for confirmation. He veered to the left, cutting across the road as they approached the bridge. The other bikers followed close behind, their lights cutting through the darkness like a string of fireflies. The sound of the syndicate's bikes grew louder, but Jake wasn't about to let them catch up. He could feel the weight of Aisha's body pressed against his back, her heart racing with every twist and turn, but she was quiet. For now, at least, she was trusting him. The bridge loomed ahead, its dark outline stark against the night sky. As they hit the bridge, Jake took a deep breath, making a sharp turn to the left, veering off onto the smaller road that ran along the river. The sharp corner made the bike wobble for a moment, but Jake's grip tightened, and he kept the bike steady. He glanced behind him again. This time, he saw the syndicate's bikes trying to catch up, their headlights growing larger. They were getting too close. "We need to hit the dirt roads," Jake muttered to himself. "They'll be able to follow us on these roads for too long." He slammed the throttle once more, the bikes surging forward, kicking up dirt and rocks behind them. The sound of their tires on the gravel road echoed in the night, the dust from the road swirling around them. The road ahead became increasingly rough, the terrain growing more unpredictable, but Jake was determined. The syndicate might have more power, but he had the advantage of knowing the back roads, the shortcuts, and the cover of the night. "Everyone, follow me," Jake shouted through the earpiece. He could hear the others responding, their voices firm and determined. They weren't just fighting for Aisha's safety now, they were fighting for survival. The syndicate wasn't going to let them get away that easily. The gravel road turned into a narrow path, the trees closing in around them. The wind had picked up, the branches of the trees shaking with each gust. A flash of headlights in the distance made Jake's heart race. He could hear the roar of the syndicate's engines getting closer. They were closing in, but they weren't going to catch them. Not yet. The narrow path twisted and turned, a labyrinth of trees and shadows. Jake could barely make out the next turn ahead, but he knew it well. He had ridden these roads countless times before. "Now," Jake shouted, pulling the bike to the right. He could feel Aisha's body shift with the movement, her grip tightening around him. The rest of the crew followed, their bikes cutting through the trees with ease. The sound of the syndicate's bikes grew quieter as they took the same turn, their engines slowing as they were forced to follow the rough terrain. Jake's eyes scanned the road ahead, his mind working through their next move. They had to lose them now. The path they were on was narrow and treacherous, the trees pressing in on either side. The rocks beneath their tires made the ride rough, but Jake's determination only grew stronger. A sharp turn came up ahead, and Jake didn't hesitate. He took the turn wide, skimming the edge of the trees. The other bikers followed, but Jake didn't look back. He knew they were relying on him. The sound of the syndicate's engines was fainter now, almost drowned out by the sound of their own bikes. They had gained some distance, but Jake knew it wasn't enough. "We're almost there," Jake muttered, his voice steady as he focused on the path ahead. Aisha shifted behind him, and for the first time since the chase began, Jake felt her relax, even if just a little. "Are we safe?" she asked quietly. Jake smiled, though it was a weary smile. "Not yet, but we're getting closer." The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, but Jake pushed forward, determined to make it out of this alive. He could hear the sound of the other bikers following closely behind him, their engines a steady hum in the background. They were in this together, and they weren't going to let anything or anyone stand in their way. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, Jake could see the first signs of civilization ahead. The chase was nearly over, but Jake knew that even as they reached safety, the fight was far from over. The syndicate was still out there, and they would do whatever it took to get Aisha back. Jake would make sure that didn't happen. Not on his watch. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the narrow, winding road as Jake and his crew rode through the quiet countryside. The sound of their bikes was muffled by the thick trees lining the path, but Jake could still feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. They had made it this far, but he knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The syndicate was still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Jake's eyes scanned the horizon as they pushed forward, the cold morning air biting at his face. He could hear the other bikers behind him, their engines roaring in unison, but the sound wasn't comforting. It was a reminder that they were still being hunted. Aisha, who had been holding on tightly to Jake, shifted behind him, her grip loosening slightly as she looked around. Jake could feel her eyes on him, even though he didn't look back. "Are we close?" she asked, her voice soft but tinged with worry. "We're getting there," Jake said, keeping his tone steady. He couldn't afford to show fear, not now. Not when Aisha needed him more than ever. He glanced at her briefly, seeing the uncertainty in her eyes. "Just keep your head down and stay close." They had reached a part of the road that twisted through dense forest, the trees creating a canopy that blocked out much of the early light. The road ahead was dark, and Jake's instincts told him that they needed to move faster. He pressed the throttle down harder, urging the bike to go faster, and the others followed suit. "Let's pick up the pace," Jake muttered to himself, scanning the road ahead. They had to get to the safe house before the syndicate caught up with them. He couldn't risk waiting any longer. As they sped down the road, the silence of the forest was broken only by the roar of their engines. The trees flashed by in a blur, the only other sounds the wind rushing past, and the rhythmic thrum of the bike's engine. "Jake," Vince's voice crackled over the radio. "We've got company." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected them to catch up so soon. He glanced over his shoulder and saw headlights in the distance, growing brighter by the second. "Damn," Jake muttered. "How close are they?" "Too close," Vince replied. "We've got to make a move now, or we're done." Jake's grip tightened on the handlebars, his eyes focused ahead. He had to think fast. They couldn't outrun them on this road. It was too narrow, too winding. They needed a plan, and they needed it now. "Take the next left," Jake ordered, his voice sharp. "Head toward the creek. We can use the water to cover our tracks." The crew responded immediately, the sound of their bikes shifting as they followed Jake's lead. The road ahead was barely wide enough for their bikes, but it would have to do. The crunch of gravel under their tires signaled that they had left the main road behind, but Jake didn't slow down. He pushed forward, knowing the syndicate was right on their tail. "Stay tight," Jake ordered, his voice tight with concentration. "We've got one shot at this." They took the sharp left, the bikes skidding slightly as they made the turn. The road grew even narrower, and Jake could hear the trees scraping against the sides of their bikes. The sound of the syndicate's motorcycles grew louder again, but Jake kept his focus. They were almost there. The creek came into view, the water sparkling under the dim morning light. It was wide and fast-moving, but it was their only chance. Jake hit the throttle harder, racing toward the water. The other bikers followed closely behind. Just as Jake reached the edge of the creek, he jumped the bike over a small ditch, landing hard on the opposite side. The others followed, one by one, their bikes thundering across the creek bed, the water splashing around their tires. Jake could feel the rush of adrenaline as they crossed. It wasn't smooth, but it worked. The sound of the syndicate's bikes was muffled now, the creek and the thick forest blocking them out. Jake slowed the bike as they reached the other side of the water, the crew falling in behind him. "We're in the clear for now," Jake said, his voice calm but alert. "But we're not out of this yet." He turned to look at Aisha, who had been holding on tightly, her face pale but determined. She looked at him, her eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're safe now," Jake said, offering her a reassuring smile. He couldn't promise her that it was over, but for now, she was safe. That's all that mattered. They pushed on, the road ahead still winding through the trees, but Jake could feel the weight lifting just a little. They had gained some ground. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the crew began to feel a little more hopeful. They weren't out of danger, not by a long shot. But they had a plan, and they were sticking to it. The syndicate would come for them again, but this time, Jake wasn't going to run. They would fight back. Together. Jake glanced at Aisha again, her grip now loosened but still holding on. She had come so far already, and now, she was in the right hands. It was a promise he had made, and he was going to keep it. The ride continued, the forest stretching out ahead of them, the sound of their engines now a rhythm, a heartbeat that kept them moving forward. There would be more challenges, but they were ready. Jake wasn't going to let them lose this fight. Not now. Not ever. The road stretched ahead, the trees now thinning as they neared the outskirts of the forest. The sound of their bikes echoed in the still morning air, the engines purring steadily beneath them. Jake kept his focus ahead, his eyes scanning the road, but also feeling the weight of the moment settling on him. They had come this far, but the end was still out of sight. The syndicate wasn't far behind, and Jake knew that no matter how far they rode, they couldn't outrun their enemies forever. He had promised Aisha that he would protect her, but the stakes were rising. The danger was only growing. Vince pulled up beside Jake, his face grim. "We're not losing them yet, but they're still out there. We can't keep this up for long." Jake nodded, his jaw clenched. "I know," he replied, his voice steady despite the tension tightening in his chest. "But we keep moving. We can't stop now. We get Aisha to safety, and then we take them down." The group rode on, but as the minutes passed, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The syndicate was relentless, and sooner or later, they would catch up. But there was no turning back. He couldn't let Aisha down. Ahead, the outline of a small town appeared in the distance. They had reached their next destination, a safe house they had set up in case things ever went south. It wasn't much, just a simple cabin far from the prying eyes of the city, but it was enough for now. Jake signaled to the crew to slow down, and the convoy gradually came to a stop outside the cabin. The bikers dismounted, the sound of their engines dying down as they surveyed their surroundings. "We're here," Jake said, his voice calm but filled with determination. "This is where we make our stand." Aisha climbed off her bike, looking around the cabin with cautious eyes. "Is this safe?" she asked, her voice small, still filled with the fear that had followed her all this time. Jake gave her a reassuring smile. "It is for now, but we need to stay vigilant. We won't have much time before the syndicate finds us." The crew moved quickly, unloading gear and securing the area around the cabin. Vince and the others checked the perimeter, while Jake stayed close to Aisha. "You're going to be okay," he said softly, though there was a weight in his voice. "We've got this." Aisha nodded, though her face was still pale, her eyes reflecting the storm of emotions inside her. She had come so far, and now she was on the verge of something new, something that could change everything. But the fear was still there. Jake could see it. He understood it. "I don't want to go back," Aisha whispered, almost to herself. "I don't want to face them again." Jake crouched down in front of her, his eyes meeting hers. "You won't have to. We're not letting them take you. We'll stop them, no matter what it takes." Aisha's eyes searched his face, looking for the reassurance she needed. She had been through too much to trust easily, but in this moment, She was willing to believe him. She nodded slowly, her grip on his arm tightening just a little. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. Jake stood, his resolve hardening. "We're not done yet," he said, turning to the rest of the crew. "We've got one more fight ahead of us. But when it's over, we walk away. We make sure they never come after her again." Vince approached, his face set in grim determination. "We're with you, Jake." "All the way." Jake nodded. "Let's get ready." The hours passed quickly as they made preparations. The cabin was small but well fortified, and they had set up defensive positions around the perimeter. They had the advantage of being off the main roads, but Jake knew it wouldn't take long for the syndicate to find them. He glanced at Aisha once more, her face shadowed by uncertainty, but also a glimmer of hope. She was safe, for now. But Jake wasn't about to let that safety slip away. As the day turned to night, the atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier. The crew kept watch, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement. The tension was palpable, but they stayed focused, knowing that the fight was coming. They weren't alone. The syndicate was out there, and they were closing in. Jake's mind raced with plans, his thoughts, constantly shifting between defense and offense. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not now. Not when Aisha's life was on the line. The night air grew colder, and Jake felt the weight of it pressing on him. They were ready. He could feel it in his bones. The crew was ready to fight, and Aisha was ready to be free. "Here they come." Vince's voice cut through the silence, his tone low and urgent. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the window. Through the trees, the glow of headlights pierced the darkness. The syndicate had found them. The final showdown was about to begin. Jake turned to his crew, his eyes locking onto each of them. "This is it," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "We fight for her. We fight for everyone who's ever been trapped in their game." He turned back to Aisha, his face softening for a moment. "Stay inside. Stay hidden. We'll handle this." Aisha nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and trust. She knew there was no turning back now. The battle was coming, but she wasn't alone. Not anymore. Jake stepped outside, his crew falling into position around him. The time had come to finish this, to stop running. The syndicate had been playing their game for far too long. It was time for them to lose. Jake stood tall, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He was ready, and he would make sure Aisha was safe. This was their fight, and they were going to win.